Okay, yeah, let's maybe get started. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to this webinar organized by the OECD Trade and Agriculture Directorate, where we'll be discussing agricultural policies in the Asia-Pacific region, adapting agriculture to climate change. My name is Martin van Lampe, and I'm the head of the Policy Monitoring and Evaluation Unit within the OECD Trade and Agriculture Directorate. It is my pleasure to moderate this webinar today. Agriculture faces what we call a triple challenge. First, the sector needs to ensure food and nutrition security for a growing global population. Second, it needs to provide livelihoods for hundreds of millions of farmers and other actors involved in the wider food system. And third, it needs to do so in a sustainable manner while contributing to reductions in GHG emissions and adapting to climate change. Governments around the world provide support to the sector to help address these challenges. The OECD has long been engaged in measuring and assessing the support provided to agriculture, and our agricultural policy monitoring and evaluation report now covers 54 countries, representing 3/4 of global agricultural value added. The agricultural support provided in these countries is significant, and we will hear more about this later today. And the question is whether the support provided is helping the sector to improve food security, to sustain livelihoods, and to become more sustainable and climate friendly, and whether it does so efficiently. When ministers and high-level representatives from some 50 countries met in Paris for the OECD meeting of agricultural ministers in November 2022, there was a strong call for action to improve food security and nutrition, to ensure inclusive livelihoods, and to strengthen sustainability. In particular, they committed to develop and implement policies to facilitate climate change adaptation and to encourage sustainable productivity growth, and to intensify efforts to reform and to reorient agricultural policies and environmentally harmful support measures. Climate change is a major and complex issue for agriculture. Food production is affected by rising temperatures, changes in precipitation patterns, rising sea levels, and the increasing frequency and severity of extreme weather events. Many countries in Asia and Pacific are particularly vulnerable, and millions of farmers across the region urgently need to adapt their production to climate change. At the same time, agriculture is also a major contributor to climate change. The agriculture, forestry, and other land use sector accounts for 22% of global greenhouse gas emissions. But the sector also offers ample opportunities for reducing emissions and can and must play an essential role in the fight against climate change. This webinar looks at agricultural policies in the Asia-Pacific region and addresses the question of how those policies can help agriculture to continue ensuring food security, livelihoods, and environmental sustainability, whilst helping farmers adapt to climate change. We are very fortunate to have an exciting lineup of speakers from the OECD, the Asian Development Bank Institute, as well as a distinguished panel of policymakers and experts from across the region, from Australia, Indonesia, Japan, and Vietnam, who will provide their perspectives and experiences in designing and implementing policies to address these challenges. All this should provide ample input into an open discussion, which we hope to have at the end of this webinar. I would also like to acknowledge the many participants joining us from around the world. We're very keen to hear you and from you throughout the event. Please type your questions into the chat as we go through the program, and we'll do our best to address them during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Finally, I'd like to note that this webinar is being recorded, And we intend to upload the recording to the OECD Trade and Agriculture Directorate's YouTube channel after the event, so people can actually look at it after the event as well. Now, we have a full agenda with a range of excellent speakers today, so let's get started. Let me first give the floor to Gibran Puntakai. Gibran is an agricultural economist in the Agriculture and Resource Policy Division at the OECD Trade and Agriculture Directorate, and he will provide an overview of the key findings of the latest OECD Agricultural Policy Monitoring and Evaluation 2023 report. Gibran, please go ahead.
Thank you, Martin. So today I'll present the key findings from our annual flagship Agricultural Policy Monitoring and Evaluation report, which was published in November last year. The OECD has been engaged in measuring and assessing government support to agriculture for more than 3 decades. And we have developed a coherent system to measure and classify agricultural support and to provide quantitative estimates of public support to agriculture for producers, consumers, and general services that support the sector overall. Now, our 2023 report includes a thematic focus on climate change adaptation, hence the focus of today's webinar. And this thematic focus follows on from the previous report, which focused on climate change mitigation. This slide illustrates the geographic coverage of our report, which now includes a total of 54 countries. These include all 38 OECD member countries, which are shown in green, the entirety of the European Union, which is covered by a single chapter in our report, and 11 major emerging economies, which are shown in yellow. And these countries together account for approximately 3/4 of global agricultural value added. So I'd like to start by presenting the headline numbers. So the latest numbers from our report averaged over the period from 2020 to 2022 show that governments provided $851 billion per year in support to the agricultural sector. Now, most of this support, $630 billion per year, is provided directly to producers. Then $106 billion per year was spent on general services, including R&D, biosecurity and infrastructure, and other expenditures that benefit the sector overall. And finally, consumers and other first-level buyers of agricultural commodities received $115 billion per year in budgetary support. Now, zooming in on the producer support on the second bar, we see that $333 billion per year is provided in the form of market price support, which really refers to policies that lift domestic prices above reference prices. And then on the left-hand side, we see that actually in several emerging economies, policies suppress domestic prices for some or most commodities, generating annual transfers of $179 billion away from producers. Now, the remainder of producer support comes in the form of budgetary payments to producers, which includes payments based on output and input use, payments based on factors of production, payments based on historical entitlements, and payments for public goods. So in total, these amounted to $297 billion per year. And we can see that 2/3 of producer support, so that's $411 billion per year, is market distorting and potentially harmful to long-term efforts to combat climate change and other food systems challenges. This includes market price support, payments based on output, and payments based on variable input use provided without constraints. The remainder amounts to $218 billion per year provided in a less distortive format, so that is less coupled to production and to greenhouse gas emissions, and only $1.6 billion per year provided in a non-distortive support for public goods, such as payments for ecosystem services. Now, looking at how this varies across countries, specifically in the Asia-Pacific region, we see that there's quite a lot of variation across the region. So, for instance, in Japan and Korea, support represents more than 50% of the value of agricultural production. And support is also high in the Philippines at nearly 30% of the value of agricultural production. In some countries, such as India and Indonesia, farmers face a combination of support for the production of some commodities, whilst other commodities are subject to implicit taxation due to export restrictions or other policies that suppress domestic prices. And you can see from the chart that India is also a substantial provider of consumer support, which is shown in orange. We see a similar picture in Vietnam. And in fact, in both India and Vietnam, the net support to agriculture is negative, meaning that domestic producers are implicitly taxed on average. Now, China is an interesting case because China's obviously a large agricultural producer and has actually emerged as the country providing the most support and has displaced large OECD economies which have historically held that role. However, when viewed relative to the value of agricultural production, which is what's shown in this chart, China's support stands at 17%, which is close to the average for all 54 countries. And it's still a fair bit lower than the OECD average of 25%. And finally, we have Australia and New Zealand, which both provide very low levels of support to their agricultural sectors. And policy settings are characterized by a strong emphasis on openness to international markets. So I'd like to say a few words about some of the policies that were introduced across the region in response to the war in Ukraine and inflationary pressures more broadly. Now, we know that the war in Ukraine disrupted international markets and value chains for agricultural commodities and key inputs, including energy and fertilizers. And many governments extended emergency measures or put in place new measures to assist producers and consumers. So some of the measures introduced across the Asia-Pacific region include helping Ukraine to continue producing and exporting food. So for instance, Australia was one of several countries that introduced temporary exemptions from tariffs on agricultural products imported from Ukraine. Reducing import barriers for food and fertilizers. This was observed in China and Korea. Fostering domestic fertilizer production. So for example, India increased its fertilizer subsidies twice during 2022. Japan subsidized transportation and storage costs for fertilizer manufacturers, and the Philippines introduced fertilizer discount vouchers. Then we have providing support to compensate for rising input costs. So for instance, China provided additional direct subsidies to grain farmers. Japan provided payments to livestock farmers to compensate for higher feed costs. Korea provided tax relief to farmers and direct compensation for higher feed and fertilizer costs. And the Philippines provided fuel discount vouchers to farmers. And countries also provided additional support to partly shield consumers from rising food costs. So for example, China began releasing its strategic supplies of pig meat, and the Philippines imposed price ceilings for staple foods such as milk, beef, poultry, and pork. At the same time, some countries also implemented additional export barriers that added to pressures on international markets, increasing market uncertainty and risking increased global food insecurity. Most notably, India introduced export bans, duties, or permits on several commodities, including wheat, rice, and sugar. And finally, some countries, mostly in Europe, actually eased or suspended environmental requirements to encourage domestic production, which may have resulted in increased environmental degradation. Now, while overall support to agriculture has increased over time, expenditures on general services, including R&D and innovation, infrastructure and biosecurity, continue to represent a small share of transfers towards the agricultural sector. These investments are key to fostering sustainable productivity growth, adapting to climate change, and addressing other food systems challenges. So here again, we see that expenditures on general services measured relative to the value of agricultural production vary significantly across Asia-Pacific countries. They are highest in Japan and Korea, although infrastructure, often for irrigation, represents a large share of these expenditures, especially in Japan. Support for general services is also above the OECD average in the Philippines and India. And for the remaining countries in the region, general services expenditures as a share of the value of agricultural production are below the OECD average. So in Australia, we see there's actually a strong emphasis on R&D and innovation, which accounts for more than half of general services support, while in New Zealand, spending on general services is split roughly evenly between investments in R&D and biosecurity. And we also find that growth in R&D and innovation expenditures has slowed significantly, and it will be crucial to reverse this trend and increase the share of R&D expenditures in support of climate change adaptation. So our report outlines 6 transformative actions for policymakers to improve agriculture's resilience to climate change and other shocks. First, phase out measures that hinder adjustments to production, such as market price support and other policies targeting specific commodities that increase the rigidity of food systems by reducing farmers' incentives to adjust their production to changing conditions. Second, governments should ensure that risk-related information is available to farmers and other market participants, that insurance markets function well, and that recovery-related support focuses on large-scale systemic or catastrophic risks that cannot be borne by farmers or risk markets. Third, invest in targeted interventions supporting climate change adaptation and the sector's transition to more sustainable and resilient agriculture and food systems. Fourth, favour no-regret measures that support resilience in a wide range of circumstances. This could include facilitating international trade in agricultural commodities and their inputs, R&D focused on improved management of natural resources, and the provision of other general services such as biosecurity and key infrastructure. Fifth, enhance the agricultural knowledge and innovation system and its focus on sustainable productivity growth. So here, public expenditures should really target productivity growth that reduces the sector's use of natural resources, its emissions of pollutants and their harmful effects. And finally, incentivize the supply of public goods. So this includes support for improved environmental outcomes and public goods such as biodiversity conservation, water quality, habitat restoration, or other ecosystem services, and reorienting existing support that is distorting or environmentally harmful provides an opportunity for supporting public goods without requiring additional resources. Thank you very much, and I'd encourage everyone to have a look at our report on our website.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Gibran. Some of you may already have questions or comments, so please do use the chat function and type them in there. We'll go through them at the end of the webinar in the open discussion. Let me now hand over to Kelly Coburn. Kelly is an agricultural economist in the Agriculture and Resource Policies Division at the OECD Trade and Agriculture Directorate. She was actually the lead author of the report's thematic chapter and will deliver a presentation on adapting agriculture to climate change, lessons for the Asia-Pacific region. Kelly, over to you.
Thank you, Martin. I will be talking about the thematic chapter that focuses on climate change adaptation. As we know, agriculture is already experiencing the impacts of climate change through changes in rainfall and temperatures, as well as changes in the provision of ecosystem services and the frequency and severity of extreme events. So what you can see in this graphic is that there's been a pronounced increase of about fourfold in the number of extreme events or natural disasters worldwide since the early 1970s through to 2020. Even if we start to make progress towards mitigation goals, we believe that adaptation is both urgent and essential. So to start thinking about what countries are doing now to support climate change adaptation in agriculture, we wanted to address two questions in the thematic chapter of this report. The first is whether governments have become more interested in agricultural adaptation over time. And the second is, what are governments currently doing to both support agricultural adaptation and potentially to impede it? So to answer the first question, what we did is we undertook an analysis of the documentation submitted by the 54 countries covered in the report to the UNFCCC, both through the convention and through the Paris Agreement. So with that, we have a record of documentation submitted by governments over the course of 30 years, and we can start to assess the degree to which interest in climate change adaptation has changed over time. Looking at those reports, what we can see is that the expressed or articulated interest in climate change adaptation generally has increased by about fourfold over the past 30 years. Ideas related to resilience have begun to gain traction in these reports, so we can see that there's an increasing discussion of these concepts. When we look at agricultural references over time, what we see is that they've remained relatively constant in the national communications. However, the way that governments are discussing agriculture has changed. So what we can see, you're on the left-hand side, you're looking at a graphic for OECD countries, and on the right-hand side, a graphic for the emerging economies covered in the report. What we can see is that the majority of the discussion of agriculture focuses on mitigation goals. This is more so for the OECD countries covered in the report. But that emphasis has been declining over time. What we see is that adaptation, which is in the blue, has actually increased over the 30 years covered by the reports. This is particularly true amongst the emerging economies covered in the report, where documentation of adaptation needs is important to obtain climate financing. We see that emphasis on vulnerabilities has decreased slightly over time in the reporting, and that more recently among OECD countries, there's been increased articulation of concerns related to adaptation mitigation co-benefits. So our second question, really following up on that, is, okay, governments seem to be more interested in adaptation. What are they doing to try to support adaptation in the agricultural sector? And what actions might they be engaged in that could be potentially impeding adaptation? So for this, we undertook a stock take of adaptation programs and activities in the 54 countries covered in the report. We categorized the adaptation approaches and programs that were reported to us and that we gathered information on ourselves. And then we also evaluated the potential for distortions from existing policies. So what we found is that across the 54 countries covered in the report, we found evidence of 600 adaptation programs currently in place. So what you're looking at on the right-hand side is a categorization of those adaptation programs, where the size of the rectangle corresponds to the proportion of programs that are in that category. The majority of programs, which are represented in blue, fall into the category of social, economic, and institutional measures. So these really are measures that are undertaken by governments, such as planning for adaptation or risk contingency planning. These are measures related to capacity building, such as extension and training, and also measures related to climate services, such as early warning systems and climate predictions, for example. So the majority of programs fall into this category, about 61%. The second greatest category falls into what we would describe as ecosystem-based approaches to adaptation. So by and large, this includes things like efforts to implement agroecological measures, programs that attempt to improve soil health and fertility, and programs targeting increased diversification of agricultural systems. Those account for 19% of the programs reported to us. Following that, at 11% are infrastructure and technological approaches to adaptation. So this includes things like crop and livestock technology, as well as irrigation and drainage systems and regional water infrastructure. The final and smallest category, coming in at 9%, is behavioral and cultural measures. So this includes programs that target directly changes in crop and livestock management or operations, as well as programs that are oriented towards breeding or breed selection. So I'd like to point out that the majority of measures reported by governments fall into this category of social, economic, and institutional support or programs to address adaptation. But what's important about these measures is that they often support responses by producers. For example, when extension services provided by a government as a form of capacity building enable farmers to uptake drought-tolerant crops. So looking at OECD countries and breaking out Asia Pacific in particular, what we see is that 22% of all of the programs reported to us were reported from the Asia Pacific region. So that's 132 adaptation measures out of 600. What we see is that the majority are in the social, economic, and institutional category. It's similar to the OECD as a whole, so about 60%. There is a slight difference for the Asia Pacific region in the other categories. In particular, we see a greater proportion of programs that target infrastructure and technological approaches to adaptation. There's also a slightly greater emphasis on behavioral and cultural approaches, so this is real changes in the field, and a slightly lower emphasis on ecosystem-based approaches when we look at the region as a whole. So although governments have developed a large body of programs to address agricultural adaptation, what we find is that really what's lacking at this point is attention to implementation, monitoring, and evaluation. About 20% of the measures for all of the countries monitored and 30% of the measures in the Asia Pacific region specifically are focused on developing plans or planning. So really at this point, what's needed is to gather more evidence on implementation of these adaptation programs and assessing the outcomes of those programs. So how do they support farmers to adapt? How do they contribute to resilience? This is where there's really an opportunity for investment at this point. We also find that current policies are not always conducive to adaptation. So as Gibran mentioned, there are a large number of programs still in existence that support specific commodities. And what we believe is that this type of support increases the rigidity of food systems and may impede adaptation. Also, trade distortions are still present, and those can prevent the flow of goods that can smooth supply disruptions during periods of extreme weather events, for example. And then there are examples that still exist of poorly designed insurance subsidies and disaster assistance payments that can, of course, contribute to moral hazard and impede adaptation, or even worse, lead to maladaptive outcomes. I'll repeat some of the points that Gibran focused on in the overall conclusions, but in a way that's specific to adaptation. We really think that there's an opportunity for policy reform at this point, and more than an opportunity, an urgent need to reform policies to better support adaptation. Foremost of these recommendations is to phase out the most distortive forms of support that increase the rigidity of food systems. We also believe that reorienting budgetary support can be used to invest in key general services, including innovation and research and development, to explore ways to enhance resilience while also potentially supporting mitigation goals. We believe that no regret measures that support resilience under a wide range of uncertain climate outcomes are a worthy investment. And then also undertaking targeted action for mitigation and adaptation, including reorienting environmentally harmful support to the provision of public goods, can better support resilience in the sector. Finally, we would recommend considering actions also to support transformation and structural adjustment in the sector, which may include such measures as measures that support diversification of income sources for producers, as well as considering off-farm employment opportunities, and then phasing out barriers to adaptive transformation, including subsidized insurance schemes and environmentally harmful support. So with that, I will leave that there. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact us.
Thanks so much, Kelly. Very well. Let's move directly into the presentation from the Asian Development Bank Institute. And we have Dr. Dil Rahoot with us, who is the Vice Chair of Research and Senior Research Fellow at the Asian Development Bank Institute in Tokyo. And Dr. Rahoot will speak about climate-smart agriculture for adaptation to climate risk. Dr. Rahoot, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Martin, for giving me this opportunity to present some of the findings from our work that we have been doing here at ADBI. Basically, I'm going to present some of the key findings that we bring from a special issue that we did with the Journal of Mitigations and Adaptation Strategies for Global Change. So with that journal, we had a special issue, and we had a large number of papers, 15 papers. So from there, I draw this information to present to the group here today. Just to give you a brief background on the climate change, as Sivran and others highlighted, that the climate change is basically emerging from human activities, and it has increased significantly over the years. And we all have recognized that that climate change is a major event that's happening and also touching everybody's life across the world. And as it got highlighted in the previous presentations, that the intensity and the frequency of climate shocks has increased. There has been intense drought, intense flood, cyclonic event, heat waves, and altered rainfall pattern. And this climate change is adversely impacting the agriculture sectors, and we have felt it, and we have acknowledged the impact of climate change on the agriculture sectors. And this impact is resulting into food insecurity and nutritional insecurity. But with the rate at which climate change is progressing, this threat is going to multiply, and is going to it could be catastrophic to all of us. However, one thing that I'd like the participant to note here is that climate change is the agriculture sector is very vulnerable to the climate change, but also is a perpetrator to the climate change. It contributes to about a quarter of the GHG emissions. So we should also acknowledge that fact. The reason why agriculture is so vulnerable to climate change is because agriculture is directly dependent on weather conditions, and hence extremely vulnerable to climate shocks. About 60% of the crop yield variability can be influenced by climatic conditions, making climate as an essential factor for productions. So having said this, I'd like to reiterate what my other panelist presenter pointed out, that if without any effort to adapt to climate change and mitigate the climate change at 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade, food security risks due to climate change could be catastrophic. So this is something that I really want to emphasize. And the reason why I want to emphasize here is that mitigations can take long time. And while we attain net zero carbon emissions, is very, very important to adapt to climate change, particularly for the agriculture sectors, because almost 500 million farm households are smallholder farmers, and they have limited capacity to adapt to climate change. Any failure to act and adapt to climate change would lead to malnutrition, micronutrient deficiency. If you look at globally today, almost 2 billion people are anemic, and similarly other micronutrient deficiency. Hence, it's very, very urgent that we put everything together to adapt to the climate change. And also, if we don't do anything, almost 36% of additional people could face hunger, and under low emissions also on about 11 to 33% could face hunger. So these are some of the points. Now for Asia, it's very important. The reason is that if you look at, I've taken this top 10 GAG emitting countries from Asia from agriculture sector, FLU sectors, and if you see agriculture to GDP ratio, Asia has almost 7.7% of the GDP is from agriculture sectors. And if you look by countries, you can see Pakistan is about 23%, Myanmar 23%, Indonesia 13%. So most of the Asian countries are heavily dependent on agriculture sectors for the economy. And similarly, if you look at the export, almost 4.2% of the total exports come from agriculture sectors. And if you look by countries, Indonesia's 22.4% of the export is from agriculture sectors, and almost 25% for Myanmar. So all these countries have very, very high export dependency on agriculture sectors, and also a source of foreign exchange earning. And if you look at the number of people who are dependent on agriculture sectors, it's humongous. So having said that, where we stand is that we have very high level of undernutrition. We also face severe food insecurity globally, and so is in Asia, and all these countries also saw similar kind of thing. So under these situations, what is it that we have for us, which is low cost and scalable? That's climate smart agriculture. Climate smart agriculture technology can play a very important role in climate change adaptations. So CSA is an integrated approach to managing landscape, cropland, livestock, forest, fisheries that addresses the interlinked challenges of food security and climate change. It aims to tackle three main objectives: sustainably increasing agriculture productivity and income, adapting and building resilience to climate change, and reducing and removing greenhouse gas where possible. And the interventions that we have is, we have weather smart technology, water smart technology, seeds and breed smart, nutrient and carbon smart, market and financial smart, and institutional smart. The outcome is that we'll have better productions, food security, nutritional security, financial security, and resource security. And in CSA, you can see there are a number of, as our colleague from OECD pointed out, that there are over 600 different kind of adaptations technology. Here, I'm trying to point out some of the CSA, very prevalent CSA technology that's being adopted in South Asia. You can see the most important one is climate resilient seed. This is widely being practiced, and most of the literature found so, followed by water conservation technology. And then the other one is reduce, zero or no tillage, and farmyard manure, and then crop diversifications, as pointed out by my colleagues from OECD, and farm diversification. So we have areas of CSA technology which could be low cost to high cost. So depending on the affordability, farmers tend to use this technology to adapt to climate change, and also to contribute to net zero carbon emissions. And as our colleagues just highlighted, that we could club this CSA technology into various kinds. So here we have tried to club into three different categories: the institutional factor, the socioeconomic factors, and climate factor. Because of the changing climate, the increasing rainfall, delay in rainfall patterns, farmers tend to adopt climate smart agriculture technology. And then you can see the institutional factors that plays a very, very critical role, and also the other social indicator. And here, just it's also important to note, CSA adoptions not only help us to protect our crop, our agriculture sectors, but also it helps in contributing to other SDGs. And we found that CSA can, through adoption of CSA, we can also significantly achieve SDG 1, that's reducing poverty, and also contributes to zero hunger significantly, and also it contributes to clean water and sanitations, and also climate actions. So these are some of, and I have highlighted how it helps. So one of the challenge for climate, climate change adaptations and mitigations is the development finance. So I'll just show you some of the development finance. This is actually from Southeast Asia. So we find that most of the climate related finance, it's actually we borrowed from OECD. It comes from these major countries like France, Japan, Korea, and Germany. These are the top 10 climate related finance providers in the world to the Southeast Asian countries. So France, Japan, Korea, Germany, Australia, they are among the top, and others contribute a little less. And most of these climate related finance are grant. These are grants, and about 33% are from loan. And then which sectors gets most of this climate related funding? If you look at it, it mostly comes to multi-sectors, water supply, disasters, transport, and is about 194, which is quite low. But given the vulnerability of agriculture sectors, given that the farmers have limited capacity to adapt to climate, and also the importance of agriculture sectors for ensuring food, nutritional security, and also tackling poverty, I think we need to put in bigger amount of resources, climate finance resources, to the agriculture, forestry, and fisheries sectors. So now coming back to climate adaptations, if you look at climate adaptations finance, it's mostly coming from Japan, France, Korea, Germany, Australia, and then rest, they are top 10, and the rest are quite small. So these are the countries that contributes to the climate adaptations. And also, if you look at it by sectors, agriculture sectors is in the middle, whereas other sectors receive huge amount of money. So as I already pointed out, we need to see how we can focus, redirect climate adaptations finance to agriculture sectors, so as to ensure food security, and also to be able to attain most of the SDGs. And in the mitigation finance, you can see the France and Australia are the largest providers, and it's mostly like it's in between. Like we have debt also as much as the grants, and the recipients here, if you look at it, it's agriculture sectors also is not the highest. It comes in between. Energy sectors receive the most. I think that's also correct, because energy contributes to about 3/4 of the GHG emissions. And finally, to conclude, yes, we have made a significant progress in terms of agriculture productions, and also achieving food and nutritional security. But the climate change is rapidly rising, with increase in the intensity of flood, drought, irregular rainfall, and posing significant threat to the agriculture sectors, as agriculture sectors is weather sensitive. Therefore, if you want to protect the livelihoods of over 2 billion smallholders, like 500 families, but 2 billion farmers who are dependent on agriculture sectors, we really need to invest on adaptations to climate change. Failure to invest on adaptations will not only affect this family, but also will affect export earning, will also affect the economy and other dependent allied industries. And so climate smart agriculture, it's low cost and easily scalable. We don't need a high amount of skills, so it's very scalable. So trying to promote climate smart agricultures could significantly contribute in adaptations to climate change in the agriculture sectors. So failure to adapt to climate change would threaten food and nutritional security, and I would say that smallholders, particularly from developing countries, are the most vulnerable. Therefore, one of the barrier for scaling climate smart agriculture technology is the financing. So I would like to strongly urge the government, international communities to invest on research and development in climate smart agriculture technology, and also scaling it up. With this, I'd like to thank everyone and OECD for giving me an opportunity to present some of the key highlights from our special issue. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Dr. Raut, for this insightful presentation. Let's now move into the panel discussion. We'll hear from policymakers and experts from across the Asia-Pacific region. And in fact, we have 4 panelists with us today, and each of them will share their country's experience in helping agriculture to adapt to climate change. And each representative will speak for about 5 to 6, maybe 7 minutes. Firstly, we'll hear from Tim Whitnell, who is an economist for trade and global change at ABARES, the Australian Bureau for Agricultural and Resource Economics and Sciences. And I should add that Tim also worked with us at the OECD last year and is one of the leading authors of the 2023 monitoring report. In fact, he co-authored the thematic chapter on climate change adaptation together with Kelly and Gibran, and was the lead author of chapter 2 on developments in agricultural policy and support. Tim, you have the floor.
Thanks, Martin, for that introduction. I'll just put my slides up on the screen. Okay. All right. Well, thank you. And thanks to the OECD for the opportunity to present on Australia's experience with climate change adaptation policy. So climate change is a particularly pressing issue for Australian agriculture. Australia is among the set of countries which already face lower than average rainfall and high rainfall variability. So Australia's climate has warmed on average by 1.4 degrees Celsius since 1910. Winter season rainfall has dropped by up to 20% since 1970 in some key cropping regions. And recent ABARES work has estimated that the shift in climate conditions since the year 2000 has reduced farm profits by an average of 23%, or around 29,000 Australian dollars per year, which at today's exchange rate is about 19,000 US dollars. Looking ahead, ABARES simulations suggest that farm profits in 2050 could range from between 2 and 32% below the historical climate period if warming is kept to the IPCC's intermediate projections. So evidence suggests that Australian farmers are in fact already adapting to the longer-term changes in climate. So the orange line in this chart shows the total factor productivity of cropping farms in Australia since the late 1980s. And while it has been increasing, it's been heavily influenced by periodic episodes of severe drought in the early to mid 2000s and from 2018 to 2020. The red line, on the other hand, shows the TFP after controlling for the effects of climate, where we see farm productivity has been growing much more steadily and has in fact climbed 68% since the 1980s. So farmers have made a variety of management practice changes to adapt to reduce winter rainfall. For example, around 70% of Australian cropping farms now engage in minimum or no-till practices to better retain summer soil moisture. There's also evidence of shifts in location of farming activity happening over time, with cropping activity moving to higher rainfall zones on the coast and away from some inland areas that have been affected by the deteriorating climate. So farmers are incentivized to adapt in order to improve their own long-term profitability. And as we've seen, there is evidence that this is already underway. So then what's the role for policy? Well, in Australia, the strategic intent of climate policy has shifted away from seeking to protect and insulate farmers towards enabling farmer preparedness and self-reliance. In some cases, well-intentioned policies that seek to insulate farmers or compensate for losses from climate events can in fact disadvantage farmers who have been better prepared compared to farmers who have provided assistance and relief. This can dilute management incentives and raises some difficult equity issues. So supporting farm households experiencing hardship is of course legitimate and important, but for the long-term health of the farm sector, this needs to be done in ways that promote resilience and improve productivity, and allows for adjustment and change. So in short, policy needs to get ahead of the curve. So how do we do that? I'll run through just a few examples of things that Australia is doing to enable farmers to adapt. The first of those is through better information. So uncertainties over the future climate can be a major hindrance preventing necessary long-term investments. As an example of better information, ABARES is part of a program to establish a national drought early warning system, which will develop a set of indicators for measuring and forecasting the extent and severity of drought impacts on Australian agriculture. How you then communicate this information is also an important consideration. The early warning system will join other information that's already available through online portals, such as those you can see on screen now, the Drought Resilient Self-Assessment Tool, and Climate Service for Agriculture, where farmers can log on and find tailored information for their area, including projections of their own future climate. The second way of enabling adaptation is through research and development. So Australia has long established research and development corporations for 15 major agricultural commodity groups produced in Australia, which are funded jointly through producer levies that are matched by the government. This commodity-based system is well placed to research the incremental adaptation needed to improve traditional crop and livestock production systems, such as drought-tolerant varieties suited to our local growing conditions. A third way of assisting farmers to adapt is incentivizing risk management. As an example of this, Australia provides farm management deposits, a scheme which provides a mechanism for farmers to benefit from tax advantage savings in high production and profit years that can be drawn upon in times of lower rainfall, putting a new spin on the old proverb of saving for a rainy day. As of February of this year, there are around $6 billion in these saving schemes, providing a buffer for farms in the event of adverse conditions. And then the last thing I wanted to touch on was our limited support, which enables transformation. So the long-term consequences of climate change for Australian agriculture are difficult to quantify. If recent trends continue, it suggests we may need to see continued structural changes occur, such as shifts in location of farming activity or shifts from cropping into more livestock or mixed farming. We're also likely to see further farm consolidation into fewer, larger farms, which tend to be more profitable and better able to adapt to adverse conditions. And there's also potential opportunities for transitions to other land uses, such as sequestration or green energy production, to replace or complement farm incomes. Australia's low support environment means that there are fewer impediments to this sort of transformational change, as it does not lock producers into existing production patterns. So there are, of course, lots of other areas that are important to climate change adaptation, such as infrastructure and biosecurity, but for the sake of time, I'll leave it there. Thanks again to the OECD for putting on this webinar on an important topic, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Thanks so much, Tim. Our next speaker is Talim Suraryanto, Senior Agricultural Economist at Indonesia's National Research and Innovation Agency, BRIN. Mr. Suraryanto, over to you, please.
Sorry, I mute the microphone. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much, Martin, for the opportunity. I will be very brief to speak on first related to technology innovations. This slide is on.
No, we can't see it. It was on, but not in full screens mode. And now it's off again.
Can you see it?
No, we don't.
Oh, sorry.
But if this slides don't work, maybe you speak without them, or well, just we see
Yes.
we should see the slides now. If you just go to the first one and don't worry
Okay.
about the full screen, that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, to begin with, just review what's the current initiative, mostly on related to technology innovations intended to promote the sustainable productivity growth. I think, as mentioned by previous speaker as well, mostly focus in addition to technology that enhance increase on productivity, but also to related to sustainability. So it consists about technology, crop varieties, and livestock breed, and also the climate smart practices and technologies. Just to mention a few, again, varieties, calendar system, water balance, and efficient equipment and maintenance. Yeah, just to mention the number, in 2015-21, for example, there are roughly 5 or 7 crop varieties, and in 2002, out of these 208 varieties has been disseminated and transferred to the farmer. But there is some institutional problem in view of emphasizing the role of R&D in Indonesia. So perhaps you follow the development that since 21-22, R&D function in the technical ministries, including Ministry of Agriculture, has been integrated into the newly created agency, National Research and Innovation Agency, so that MOA lose R&D function and significant human resources. So how is then the flow of technology innovation from BRIN into Ministry of Agriculture? So in the past, before integrated into BRIN, the R&D result from MOA had been well connected to the extension system and agricultural field programs. Currently, BRIN established a coordination forum to link the R&D program and result responding to the need of MOA, but then the effectiveness of this forum is yet to be assessed. So in summary, currently there is some kind of missing link between R&D program at BRIN and the agricultural development program at Ministry of Agriculture. There is a proposal ongoing to establish a unit within MOA to bridge more systematically on the technology innovation flow from particularly from BRIN to the ministry. The second point that I would like to emphasize is related to future agriculture, and so most recent study, including my own study on rural transformation, shed some light on the following. First, there are 2 indicators. Agriculture production has been transformed from staple food, including rice, toward the more high-value commodities. 40.6% in 1999, for example, has increased to 50.2% in the last decade. And also, the second indicator is rural employment has been shifted toward the non-farm sector from 28 to 66% in the same period. And more importantly, this transformation has some impact, positive impact to higher rural household income and lower poverty incidence. I think there's 2 major policy goals for the government. But as we see also you mentioned also in the report earlier, that current support policies and program continues to focus heavily on the staple food production to achieve self-sufficiency. For example, to illustrate the number, during 2015-2020, roughly 50% of R&D budget allocated to increase productivity on staple food, which actually rise. And major support policies also fertilizer subsidy and market price through import control. So there is current proposal of the ministry to increase the subsidized fertilizer by 100% in from 2023 to 2024 currently. And the same thing is the corresponding increase with the budget related to this policy. So there is concern on major impact to the emissions and other environmental factors, so that the policy recommendation to phase out this the fertilizer subsidy, I think, still in place, even though there is no progress so far on this subject. I think I stop there, Martin. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mr. Sudaryanto. And our third panelist is Hajime Sugimura, Deputy Director of the International Strategy Division in the International Bureau of the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries of Japan. Mr. Sugimura, over to you, please.
Thank you, and it is my great honor to join this outreach event for the Asia Pacific region. So I'm starting with an oral update this time, so if I'm allowed. So before getting to the main topic, I'd like to share my personal observation I made regarding the climate change and adaptation trends and agriculture policy during my attendance at COP28 in Dubai last December. I was actually shocked by the significant presence of over 100,000 participants, but the presence of agricultural policy makers and experts was a little bit invisible for me, at least for me. So the Ministry of Environment and the environmental groups took center stage in the negotiation discussion. So, but I think it's never too late to bounce back. So to put agriculture back into the mainstream in the discussion of the climate change adaptation, so it might be essential for agricultural stakeholders in each country to actively engage in climate change discussions and address adaptation and mitigation strategies in holistic manners. So from that perspective of view, so today's event is so valuable for policymakers and experts across the Asian Pacific region for mutual learning and collaboration with the OECD, the leading international organization in this area. So please let me move to today's main topic. I'd like to explain two topics very briefly. Japan's approach to agriculture policy for adaptation and our stance on international cooperation. So Japan, as you might all know, Japan has a very long, narrow land area, widening from north to south around 3,000 kilometers, and the natural conditions vary greatly from place to place. So Japan is also vulnerable, particularly vulnerable to natural disasters due to its geographical conditions. So under this condition, our approach to adaptation put importance on the utilization of local resources and the sustainable enhancement of productivity and the improvement of resilience. And we also emphasize the promotion of environmentally beneficial agricultural practices. To achieve these goals, we are underscoring technological innovation and collaboration with all across stakeholders, including private companies, research institutions, and consumers. For example, in August last year, we revised an agricultural policy package targeting climate change adaptation, which has mainly 5 policy targets. So the first one is research and development on high temperature resilient and high quality crop varieties like rice and fruit trees. And the second point is integrated pest control that can respond to an increase in pests and diseases. The third point is climate smart agriculture using AI and ICT. And the fourth point is risk management by producers and producer groups using insurance systems. And the final point is disaster resilience by maintaining and developing the function of agricultural infrastructure, mainly targeting irrigation system. And I'd like to, on top of that, I'd like to add some topics that we are recently focusing on. The first one is in discussions of climate change, various initiatives focusing on adaptation and mitigation in agriculture, such as Aim for Climate and VAX. So one of the interesting topics in policy approach that directly connects producers and researchers to use the full-scale on-farm data to develop feasible and viable technologies rapidly. So agricultural policy can support such approach to improve farmers' livelihoods and promote adaptation at the same time. The second point is, as I mentioned earlier, for those countries with many natural disasters like Japan, I believe two-side approach is very important. So one is infrastructure resilience, and the second point is risk management by producers by themselves. For example, Japan has introduced a cross-commodity agricultural insurance system for farmers that compensate for income loss in the event of extreme disasters. So by supporting the operation of this system, the government can contribute to stabilizing farmers' livelihoods. The final point is also regarding the climate change adaptation. So communication with various stakeholders is quite important, especially for those who are a little bit distant, relatively distant from the farm, like distributors, retailers, and consumers. For example, we are promoting visualization of producers' efforts for adaptation and mitigation that can enhance the understanding of consumers by using labels and the standards for the among supply chain stakeholders. I moved to the second topic for the Japan's cooperation with the Asia Pacific region briefly. We chaired the G7 ministerial meeting last year, and we delivered a clear commitment to promote climate change adaptation and mitigation, and that was endorsed by the Emirates Declaration, which was announced at COP28 last December, and Japan also joined the declaration, of course. So, and based on such a kind of a high-level international agreement, we are promoting international cooperation with ASEAN region, which shares similar natural conditions by utilizing Japan's advanced agricultural technology. For example, we are collaborating, right now we are collaborating with ADB to use the joint credit mechanism scheme to contribute to the climate change response in agriculture sector across the ASEAN region. So starting from my personal experience, I stop here, and I look forward to further discussions and learning from our colleagues today. I give it back to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was very useful. Before we move to the last speaker, maybe just a reminder that we have the chat function where you can put your questions for the open discussion. And at the last panelist, we'll have Mr. Tran Gong Tang, Director General of the Institute of Policy and Strategy for Agriculture and Rural Development in Vietnam. Mr. Tang, the floor is yours.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you well.
Can you give me the right to share the screen, because here I cannot share my screen. So I need the host to allow me to share the screen.
Gibran, can you do that?
Should be working now.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we do.
Okay, so thank you very much. So first, thank you OECD to organize the very interesting workshop webinar with a very interesting topic about the climate change adaptation in agriculture sectors. And I go very straightforward to some issue that we're going to talk. The first is related to the Vietnam experience with the agriculture policy reform to support the climate change adaptation in agriculture sectors. Uh, and I think similar to other country, Vietnam is very inactive and very active with the climate change, and climate change adaptation and mitigation as well is one of the priority of the government. That's why the all the issue related to the climate change adaptation were the Vietnam in different laws and strategy. For example, in Vietnam, we have an environmental protection law, we have a disaster prevention and control law, and we have a forestry law, we have irrigation law. So all the law address climate change adaptation and mitigation is a very crucial solution for agriculture development in Vietnam. And also the adaptation strategy is implemented by the government through different strategy. And in Vietnam, we have a climate change adaptation strategy, and the climate change action also integrated to different strategy like the green growth strategy and the strategy for agriculture and rural development, the strategy for disaster presentation, and also the strategy for forestry development as well. So it means that there's a different policy word applies and implemented to adapt with the climate change and also for the climate change mitigation. In terms of the policy measure for adaptation, in Vietnam, we can categorize by three kinds, honestly two kinds of solution. The first one is measures we mentioned about the construction solution. By this solution, the government is very focused on developing the some like infrastructure construction, especially in Vietnam. We focus on irrigation, and so far the government spent around 60 to 70% of total investment in agriculture for irrigation. However, the irrigation in Vietnam now is very diversified. It's like a multi-purpose irrigation, such as slide intrusion prevention, proactive irrigation, hydropowers, irrigated irrigation. So those construction and infrastructure is very supportive for agriculture production to make sure that it's very positively to support the farming in Vietnam, and to help the farmer to adapt with the climate change. And the second measure in Vietnam we call the non-construction solution. It also is one of the priority for the government, and it brings the co-benefits for farmers. And there's a different kinds of the non-construction solution are stimulate and apply in Vietnam. For example, like you already mentioned about the CSAs. However, in Vietnam is a very diversified because the condition for agriculture in Vietnam diversify, and we have different ecological region. That's why we mainly apply the natural based solution. However, it's a very diversified. For example, we have a different kinds of model like a reforestation with the coastal and area, and in the Mekong Delta, we have another ways. For example, we support the farmer to transition to change from the rice to others, like for example, rice stream or maybe rice fish. So it's very diversified to enhance with the how can I say the sanitary inclusion. So that is a very good way to support the farmer to increase the income and also to adapt with the sanitary inclusion as well. And in some area, we also the government support the farmer to convert the inefficient cropland to a more profitable area. For example, in Central Highland, the government support the farmer and encourage farmer to change from the coffee to the coffee fruit tree crop integration. So that is help the farmer also increase the income as well. And the third one, it could be included in one of the like other construction or non-construction solution, but I would like to put it separately like a public investment policy. So in here, uh, due to the due to some area, especially like in coastal area and also in Mekong Delta, where a lot of like the poor farmer and low income farmer are living. That's why the government in Vietnam now in recent year is very focused uh, on the public investment in this area. So that is the major policy and the measure in Vietnam for climate change adaptation. And uh, I would like to talk about the second like a question you already mentioned about how like a can agriculture support policy in Asia Pacific country to contribute with the climate change adaptation and it's to ensure the food security and livelihood for the farmer. I think there's different kinds of the policy in here. Uh, I think we can. There's three way we can support to do it. The first one, like we can have some policy to support the farmer in like we call the transition or changing the production. I'm sure that it depends on different country. However, in long term, it is very important to focus on sustainable production. Especially here in Vietnam, we have like climate change adaptation, climate resilience, and greenhouse gas emission reduction. There's a lot of speaker mentioned about like CSAs or nature-based solution. So that is a very important thing. Is the first one. The second one, I think with the from Vietnam, we found that when the farmer do transition, they face a lot of problem in terms of financing, in terms of skills, or in terms of the policy reform. That's why the policy mechanism to support or to mobilize the financial resource with the like and also the training capacity building is a very important. Uh, Especially here in Vietnam, we not only support the farmer, we also support the community and the cooperative. That is a very important thing. And also the we take the experience from the Vietnam when we move from ride to fish or ride to swim. Another important thing is that we need to think of the market for the the commodity when we change from ride. That's why the we are very focusing on the marketing between the farmers and enterprise. And the first issue we found that in Vietnam, to make sure that the and to ensure the security, especially the for smallholders. As you know, that Vietnam is one of the top rice exporter. However, the rice farmer are the poorest in the agriculture household. So, however, the rice contribute a very important role in terms of food security and in terms of social stability. That's why in Vietnam we have a separated program to support the rice farmer. And recently, Vietnam just launched very big program. We call the 1 million hectare program of high quality and low carbon rice. So that is the very important thing. That's why I'm not sure for the other country, but in Vietnam, the Rhineland are protected. It is very important to ensure the food security in Vietnam. And sorry, and I think the last point I would like to talk about what approach can help the farmer in Asia Pacific region to have a better adaptation to climate change. So I think there's a different way from the speaker before that, I found that we already mentioned different way. However, from Vietnam, I think we have like um, six ways, six priority to support and to help farmer. The first one, I think that we need to have like some prioritize for the different kinds of measures that based on we need to ratify and measure based on the farmer income and productivity, uh, and it means that when the farmer change to the new system, it still has support them to ensure the income. So that is a very important thing because otherwise the farmer will not, follow. They may they may apply the what they want and they may apply the what help them to get the high income. So that is a very important thing. And I think it's more importantly because we have a lot of experience. That's why we can create the forum to exchange knowledge, the policy dialogue, and we can learn each other in both in terms of policy and practice. And the third one is about the mobilize the financial resource. So I think it's a very important thing. In Vietnam, we try to find the new financing policy, just like agriculture insurance. Honestly, the agriculture insurance in Vietnam is grows very slow, develops very slowly. I think in the future, it's very important the financial instrument to support the farmer. And the another one is enhancing the legal framework policy reform, as I mentioned. Like in Vietnam before, the right hand cannot change, cannot switch to others. So it fixed the right farmer had to keen on rice. However, recently we changed. So with the in the rice area, with the low productivity, and especially the rice when we have a big impact by the climate change, especially sanitary intrusion. So the government allow them to change to the swim and fish. So that's why they can get a high income. So that is a good one. And the last point here, the investment policy, especially both in infra and non-infrastructure management. So we cannot invest only in hard, like infrastructure or construction. We need to invest both in construction and also non-construction. So that is the major idea from Vietnam, and again, so thank you very much. So I think that it's very helpful to Joyce and to learn from experience from other country. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mr. Tang, and many thanks indeed to all the panelists for these excellent interventions. Let's move to the open discussion that we have, and in fact we have the first question already in the chat coming from James Fell from ABERS, and the question I think goes to probably to Indonesia. Indonesia is moving its capital partly in response to climate change. Can we expect the location of agriculture in Southeast Asia to also move on such a big scale? Can policies throughout Southeast Asia be liberalized to help enable farmers to choose what, where, and how they produce? I guess that's probably to Mr. Sudaryanto, if you want to respond to that. We can't hear you.
Yeah.
Ah.
Okay, I'm trying to digest the questions. Yeah, I think that's possible, but of course it needs some, cooperation and common talk within South Asia's member countries to add that initiative, if it's agreeable to all relevant countries. That's possible. That's perhaps that's my quick answer on this subject. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I may just want to ask a question to Dr. Rahoot, if I may also just use my my role as the moderator here. You presented some really interesting statistics on the landscape of financing for climate change adaptation and mitigation in the Asia-Pacific region. And I wonder, what are the main challenges for scaling up financing for agricultural adaptation across the region? Would you mind to maybe elaborate a bit on that?
Thank you, Dr. Martin. I think it's a very important question. And if you see my former panelists also, they strongly highlighted the need for more financing on the agriculture sectors. And the reason why there is more need for investment in the financial sector is because this is the most vulnerable sectors. That's one. And second thing is that most of the people who are in the agriculture sectors are smallholder farmers whose land holding is less than 5 hectares. So they are the one who needs most financing when you come to climate. But despite the fact they don't receive enough. And if you look at 2017-18, you can see only about 20 billion per year was allocated to agriculture sectors globally. I'm talking about globally. And then when you go to mitigations, and then mitigation was only about about 8 billion. So it's smallholder farmer got only about 8 billion. It's very tiny. The reason is because one of the things is that I think one is lack of knowledge. Second thing is that the domestic resources that we have, and there is a competing need, so it's very difficult to put in domestic resources for climate adaptations in agriculture sectors. And also globally, I think most of the financing in the agriculture sectors goes as the subsidies for fertilizers, pumps, and other use. And it's very important that we divert this financing for let's say more polluting inputs to adaptations and mitigations, and even in the like our friend from Japan highlighted, even in the COP 29, you could see that most of the discussions was led by Ministry of Environments, and agriculture had very small space. So somehow I think we need more space in the global forum. Agriculture sectors need to be well represented so they can raise their case and ensure that they get enough resources to finance mitigation, but also adaptations, because the mitigation is not going to happen today. I mean, like net zero carbon emissions will take another 40, 50 years. Till then, the smallholder farmers need to adapt. So we really need to, experts like OECD, particularly agriculture departments and government agriculture department needs to lobby in COPs and other global forums to ensure that we get enough resources for financing adaptations and mitigations in the agriculture sectors.
Excellent. Thanks very much. We do run out of time here, and I'm conscious of time, but I do want to just maybe give a chance to have a discussion on the last question that we just see on the chat before we close the meeting with some closing remarks. But there's one question from Pradeep Mita, I'm sorry. And the question is, how is indigenous knowledge taken into account while drafting climate resilient policies? I'm not so sure who might be able to respond to that question, although I do think it's really important. And I wonder, maybe Tim, do you have a view on that, given that you also have a lot of discussion about indigenous peoples in your country?
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Yeah, no, it's a good question. Indigenous knowledge is obviously can be an important part of the solution for climate change. So part of the climate services for agriculture funding that I believe Mr. Rahoot was talking about, the 300 million that is in climate smart agricultural programs in Australia, most of those is for grants, like small grants that are like sort of pilot programs that can, test out new knowledge and innovation. And a lot of those are involved in going to First Nation groups and research organizations, which, obviously then the next stage of that is extension programs after that. How do you communicate that information? which obviously the Future Drought Fund in Australia is geared at sort of longer term solutions to climate change in Australia. So hopefully we'll see more in that space as we go forward.
Super. Thanks very much, Tim. This has really been a really nice discussion, and I really enjoyed it. Unfortunately, we really need to move on and probably have to close here. Please, to all of those who have other questions, please do feel free to send us emails, and we'll obviously be happy to follow up bilaterally. I would now like to pass the floor to Julia Nielsen, our Deputy Director of the OECD Trade and Agriculture Directorate, to deliver some closing remarks. Julia, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. And look, thank you for what has been a very, very interesting set of presentations and discussions. So let me just make a few overarching points about what I've heard by way of summing up. So look, firstly, we heard that agriculture in the Asia Pacific region is very strongly exposed and affected by climate change. So temperatures, sea level, extreme weather events, and changing rainfall are all hitting ag in the region. But secondly, that the region also accounts for more than half of the global population, and levels of food insecurity and undernourishment remain very high. And this is we're likely to see further strains as income increases boost demand for high quality and nutritious food. We also heard that agriculture is very key for livelihoods in the region, both for smallholders and as an important source of exports and revenue. But as our colleague from the ADB said, the agriculture sector is both a victim and a perpetrator in the region. It is a major source of emissions, and there's an urgent need to adapt agriculture to climate change in order to safeguard food security. If we don't act, the effects will be catastrophic. And indeed, we're already starting to see some of those impacts, especially on the most vulnerable, like smallholders. So we need to act, but what do we need to do? So I think one of the first messages we heard is there's an urgent need to scale up climate finance, both for adaptation and mitigation in agriculture. We saw from the ADB that there are a few large donors, so support is concentrated. And while that support is welcome, despite its importance for climate change, the sector receives less financing for both adaptation and mitigation. And of course, in particular, that means smallholders get less. At the same time, we saw that domestic expenditure on agriculture often goes to polluting inputs rather than to climate change activities. So the second point is that we see that a lot of the current support in the sector continues to reinforce the current systems and not promote adaptation. And the spending on the things that we really need, R&D, biosecurity, infrastructure, and other services is not only a small percentage of agricultural support, but it's a declining one. So governments really need to be investing in those targeted interventions for adaptation and to help sustainable productivity growth in the sector. So moving beyond planning to implementation, monitoring and assessment. This is difficult because it means at the same time you have to do the short-term recovery from shocks, you need to do those medium-term incremental adjustments and also prepare for sort of long-term transformation when the existing system's untenable. So in practical terms, what does this mean? I think we heard a very interesting presentation from the Asian Development Bank on climate smart agricultural practices to increase sustainable productivity growth, adapt and build resilience to climate change and reduce or remove emissions. And there's a range of technologies across water and weather, seeds and breeds, markets, financing and institutions that are all part of the picture. And encouragingly, many of these are low cost and scalable. We also heard very interesting practices by countries. I think there were some common themes: technology and research and development for sustainable productivity growth, risk management incentives and programs for farmers, and attention to farmer income. Information is key, communication to farmers and consumers, public investment, and legal frameworks and strategies. So Mr. Sudaryanto spoke about Indonesia's efforts at adoption and rollout of climate smart varieties. And I thought he made a very interesting point about not just the important role of technology in R&D, but the challenge of connecting this research to the Agriculture Ministry and to farmers through ag development programs. And again, I think he highlighted some of this tension between food security in terms of fertilizer subsidies, but also major implications for emissions. Tim outlined that Australian farmers are highly vulnerable, but there's been a lot of activism on adaptation through information services, through commodity-based research corporations to sort of boost productivity and preparedness, and through risk management instruments. But he also highlighted the challenge of getting the incentives right for farmers to manage their own risk, and how do you help those in distress without undermining those incentives. Mr. Sujimura from Japan stressed the need for cooperation across all stakeholders, public and private, and again highlighted the role of technology, this time some very high-tech and sophisticated technology in AI, R&D on crop varieties, and using farm data to develop technologies for livelihoods and climate change adaptation. And he also highlighted Japan's important and welcome role in international cooperation. And so lastly, Mr. Tang from Vietnam highlighted the importance of the government strategies and the policy framework and really concerted action on public investment in construction solutions such as irrigation, non-construction, so trying to shift practices, crop conversion for sustainable production, and public investments to help farmers cope with drought and support conversion models. I thought he interestingly mentioned as well the importance of training. So that the key priorities of adaptation measures, forums for knowledge, financing and use of pilot programs, legal frameworks, those infrastructure and non-infrastructure investments, and financial tools. So look, I think this has been a super interesting day and very interesting set of presentations. For us at the OECD, we continue in our work both on the agricultural policy and monitoring and evaluation, and food systems and food security and nutrition to look at practices in the region. We're working with the ASEAN Secretariat and officials from ASEAN countries to identify their priorities and key challenges on food security, and to try and encourage the kind of cooperation in data, policy and reporting across the region. So I think today has been a very good example of sharing good policy practices, sharing information and evidence. And also I hope to pick up the last point, to help motivate and engage and get us more involved in the international debate. So thanks to all the participants, and thank you to the organisers for what has been a very interesting discussion. I hope you have a good afternoon, evening or day, depending on where you are.
Thanks very much, and thanks all of you for connecting today. And don't hesitate to get in touch if you have further comments or questions to us. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.